So we're in week 5 of this thing, and I don't know about you, but I have my clutter in my attic, and in a few places in my garage. There's actually some pretty good stuff up here. Like if you put it together right, like you got this and the hat with the tricycle, right? And you can do this. And I'm just trying to get you to pay attention. But like we got in the mail in the email, which is the only mail I get now, we got these notes from one of the kids that was in last service, which we did offer him a job because he comprehended that better than most. But it does go to show that if you write things down during the sermon, it's sometimes easier to stay engaged because the pastor isn't always sitting on a pink tricycle with a multicolored umbrella and a cowboy hat, is the moral of that story. However, the clutter that drives me crazy is not this kind. It's actually the kind that's in the hall in the middle of the night. I'm a dad of 4 children. The one that pierce your feet and you need stitches and you're up at 2 a.m. in the bathroom, in the tub with your wife trying to sew you back together. That's the stuff that'll kill you. And the thing is that spiritual clutter is more like that kind of clutter. It's not something you have stuffed out somewhere that you'll deal with eventually. It's the stuff that's in the hall, it's going to trip you, you're going to fall, it's terrible. And it messes with your life, and it's always getting in the way, and it really needs to be dealt with. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in the Blueprint series is, like a blueprint, take the Christian spiritual life and simplify it as simple as it can be so you can look at the whole thing and go, oh, okay, yeah, I get that. To simplify it as simple as it can be, but no simpler. Because you might say, well, Nick, that's actually still a little complicated, sort of. Yeah, not as nearly as complicated as the building you're actually sitting in, though. And you can build out from there. You can get it in your head. You can get excited about it. You can get a sense of what you're going to do, even when it's still when it's still complete, right? And the 5 things we've done so far is, 1, that we have to connect with God. Ultimately, God is a person. We are persons. And what we're doing is we're relating to a person who is God. And that is, we have to connect with God. But he's made us to connect with other persons in the new community he's making called the church, and in the humanity around that as well. We're meant to be connecting with other people. That we have to grow. Spiritual growth doesn't just naturally happen, but we have to grow to become like Jesus, and we need to do that by understanding the gospel. One of the greatest tragedies in the world, frankly, I know that sounds like an overstatement, but one of the greatest tragedies for sure in the Christian church is that so many of us go to church and don't know the Christian message really. We still believe it's some kind of moralism or some kind of personal therapy that everything should be great for us. We don't really understand the dynamic of the gospel, and it really impoverishes us. We can't experience its joy, its thankfulness, its motivating power, its freeing power. But also, we don't know the Word of God written in the Bible. And that's one of the things that has to happen. I talked last week about that and how it's not nearly as scary as you might think, and I will refer you to that sermon rather than preaching it again. The last 2 weeks are on serve. So connect, first 2 weeks, grow, second 2 weeks, serve. And this morning we're talking about serving the city. That is, we are meant to be a people for the good of others. We should be a people who Jesus said would be among the most hated in the earth, and yet for people to recognize that we exist and we live for their good. Now, any group of scriptures from the Bible that I would use to demonstrate that this is at the heart of Christian faith is going to be really selective, because this truth is everywhere in the Bible. It's in passages, it's assumed in passages, it's argued in passages. One of the more famous ones is this one in Mark 10, where Jesus is just about getting to the point of the cross, and his buddies, the disciples, are still arguing about who's better than whom and who's going to have the best place when Jesus is ruling. And Jesus stops them and he says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles are everybody who's not Jews, right? So all the kingdoms in the world, everywhere in the world, everywhere, this is the way it is. That the Gentiles, when somebody's in charge, they act like they're in charge. They lord it over everybody else. And the high officials, people who have an official capacity, use that official capacity to exercise their authority over everybody. And then he says, not so with you. Instead, in contrast to, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first has to be a slave for all. For, what's the justification for this? Even the Son of Man, that's Jesus, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, there is a certain kind of sacrifice, or I should say it this way, a certain kind of suffering that Jesus did die for you so that you wouldn't have to suffer it. The judicial moral penalty for your cosmic sinful failure and mine, Jesus died for. He paid that entire price. He took it totally away, and we are entirely free from it. That kind of suffering we have been saved from by Jesus. But the sacrificial kind, the kind of suffering that enters into a sinful world and for the good of others lays down itself so that someone else can be helped, redeemed, nurtured, freed, Jesus ushered that into our lives. You've got to face that if you're going to be a Christian. The older Christians from past centuries used to call that the way of the cross. That there is a kind of suffering we're saved from by Jesus, the unbearable kind, and the kind that produces nothing other than our own penalty. But there's another kind of suffering that Jesus saved us to, the kind that redeems, helps, frees. In that, he brought into our lives an enormous amount. The way other people do it, it's not going to be with you. Whoever wants to be great has to be a servant of everyone. Whoever wants to be first has to be a slave for all. Because even Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. There have been a lot of surveys over the years of the American population, and the majority of how people answered the question, what are you here for, has changed over the years. Before about sometime in the middle of the 70s, the majority of Americans, when asked the question, what are you here for, what does your life mean, would answer something along the lines of, I'm here to serve others. That's the purpose of my life. I'm here to serve others. Somewhere around the middle of the 70s, the majority tipped, and the majority of people began to say something much more along the lines of, I'm here to find happiness. It also marked a transition in our culture from character, the focus of a person being character, I'm just like everybody else, I have character, or personality. Now, you might not think that's true because you'd be like, you know what, Nick? The 50s weren't as good as you think they were. Well, I wasn't alive in the 50s. I have no idea what you're talking about. However, I will say this. In years past, when people faked being a good person, they faked being a person of character. So the most cynical way possible, you could look at the history of American culture, okay? The most cynical way possible, which probably isn't true, but let's just do it as a thought experiment. When people used to fake being good, they faked being a person of character. When somebody wants to be awesome now, they don't fake being a person of character. They fake that they're really funny, that they're really awesome, that they're really cool, that they're really trendy, that they're really creative, that they're really original. It's just changed. One commentator I heard recently said it this way: it is the result of when we believe our responsibility to ourselves outweighs our responsibility to others. I think it's a really good way to sum it up. Because if you ask people nowadays, are you just being immoral, like do you not care? No, they will. As we have become people of personality and people of the self and people who believe that we're here to seek our own happiness and to find our own happiness, if you ask those people, are you vacuous and shallow? They'll say no. No, we've gone through enough time where people don't stand up for themselves and don't do what they need, and they're in these codependent relationships. They let people walk all over them. They have all these euphemisms for why it's okay to be selfish, and they'll say, I have a responsibility to myself. And really, honestly, friends, you can, in some ways, evaluate yourself and who you are on the basis of what you really think about that quote. Right? You're either the kind of person that believes that your responsibility to yourself outweighs your responsibility to others, or that you're the kind of person who believes that your responsibility to others outweighs your responsibility to yourself. Now, some of you might be here and be like, well, Nick, I've been a Christian for years. I think of myself as a person of character, and I believe that my responsibility to others outweighs my responsibility to myself. Okay, really? Because I think this is relative, how much we do. There's a great 8-minute video that I'm not going to show you now on Desiring God YouTube site on this couple, Ian and Larissa Murphy. They were dating in college for about 10 months. She'd gotten word through friends and stuff that he was shopping for a ring. They were being very intentional about their dating relationship, and then he was in an accident. She prayed all the way to the hospital that it wouldn't be the brain. She got to the hospital. It was his brain. He didn't have 4 out of 5 brain functions one night, and the next morning he had 5 out of 5. But irreparable, horrifying, terrible brain injury. Can't really take care of himself. She decided to keep dating him. She figured they couldn't get married if he couldn't communicate with her, right? I mean, but she said if he was able to do certain things, biblically, he could be a husband to her if they could communicate, if he could lead her spiritually. Even if he couldn't earn a living, and then maybe they could get married. And she kind of hung in there, and he was able to communicate with her. He really loved her. She knew that. She loved him. She looked at biblically what marriage is, and she decided to marry him. And they got married. They are married right now. Now, am I cheating? Yes, I'm cheating. Because she took on more than was morally obligated, right? They weren't married. She was dating him, right? She morally could have not married him, right? However, I know that there are those of you who have, even if you don't want to have the impulse, you do have the impulse. Some of you want to have the impulse and you would fiercely defend it, of what a waste. She's a pretty young, vivacious, intelligent girl who she could have visited this guy in a home and still been nice to him. To marry him? I mean, like, seriously? Well, it just depends on what you think you're here for and what you think you're doing. Because for her and for him, for many of their friends around them, it made perfect sense. Wasn't weird at all. Because you see, I think that I understand that I'm here for others. I think I understand that. And then I see something like that and I go, I'm not really sure if I'm here for others. And yet as you go through the Bible over and over and over and over again, it talks about our interests and how they need to be subverted or put under the interests of others, to our own personal sacrifice, and for us to become a distant second. Here's a passage from Galatians. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. Right? Philippians 2, 3-5, similar thing. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. And you could be like, well, I can do that kind of emotionally and not be judgmental and selfish. Yeah, but look at the very next line. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. So he's not saying that this is essentially an emotional command, is he? He knows that we could take it that way. He's like, you should be humble. We're like, yeah, you're right. I should be humble. He goes, okay, well, wait a second. No. Here's what I mean by that. Look at the interests of others, what they're trying to accomplish, what they care about, what they hope for themselves, what they want to do, what they're afraid of, and you take yours, what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, the pleasures you want to have, the fears you want to avoid, and you take theirs and you put it over yours. Not just your feelings, your interests. Why? Because that's exactly what Jesus did. Right? You can see this in Jeremiah 29. I talk about this more in the small group video for this week. But when God's people go into exile, God says, I have 2 purposes for you, right? They're living in a secular city. God's people are living among a totally pagan people, and he says, I want you to do 2 things. The first thing he says, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Now, implicitly there is not marry off your daughters to boys from the secular city and vice versa in terms of gender. The implicit argument there is, no, your daughters should marry husbands within the spiritual community of God's people and vice versa, such that the people of God increase and don't decrease. You remember what the Egyptians were so afraid of about the Jews and why they decided to kill their children in Exodus? It was because they were breeding. That's what terrified them. That's what terrified them. They said, these people will overtake us because they're growing in number. And you can see this in our culture. There's a lot of bigotry towards different groups of people that they're breeding too much, and they shouldn't be. They have no business doing it. And I honestly think very similar, God would have a very similar feeling towards us. And not all through breeding. I mean, we're supposed to engage in spiritual reproduction as well. But we're not supposed to be afraid of growing as a community. The church itself, both in forming families and having children and in drawing people into the community of God, we should be growing, not decreasing in the secular city. But that is not the only charge God has given us. Because here's the thing, you know what people are afraid of? They're afraid of when we become, if we ever would become the 51st percentage point. Right? Because everybody treats everything in this culture like it's all or nothing. The person who gets 51% gets 100%, right? And people should fear that for most groups in the world, right? I mean, they should probably fear that for us because we're probably worse than our philosophy because of our depravity most of the time. And we have been in the past, right? As a Christian people, whatever on earth that means. But people should know that if we were to increase as a people, it would be for their good. He says right after, he says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. That is all your ungodly neighbors who don't like you and think that you shouldn't be part of their society because your ideas are dangerous. Pray to the Lord for them. And not just that they would come around to believe like us, but pray for their peace and their prosperity. Why? Because you know that in Christ you deserve no peace and prosperity. We deserve no peace and prosperity. We have no claim to an eternal prosperity with God or an eternal peace with Him. It's just given to us graciously because God wanted to give it to us and gave it to us in Christ and offers it to all people in Christ. And what we received by free generosity. And so we should not feel like towards our secular neighbors that, it would be really great if their life went awesome and our life went really good, and then maybe they would become Christians and they would stop bothering us. And no, we're supposed to pray for and live towards their life being full of peace and prosperity, whatever they believe. And then in the New Testament, when Peter talks about what we are as the New Testament church, he uses the language of strangers, scattered, diaspora, the same language that's used about the people when they're in exile. It's kind of funny the language he uses. He calls them elect and chosen, though strangers and scattered. Because you would think if you were scattered as a minority people among a majority people, that you were abandoned. You would think if people had the right to treat you however they wanted to, which is true of Christians in many places in the world, not true of us, but maybe more true than it used to be, that, God has abandoned us. And Peter says it this way, you're elect and chosen and scattered and dispersed. You're going to have to put that together. Why? Because God wants you among all the peoples of the world. He has a purpose for that. It's the same reason why Jesus came into the world. So if you put together this biblical teaching, right, within the church, we're to serve others by doing good to them and carrying each other's burdens. The people sitting right next to you, right? With our neighbor in our neighborhoods, right, we're to love them like we love ourselves. In our city, we're supposed to seek the peace and the prosperity of the whole city. And you got to remember that as Christians, we live disproportionately in suburbs and rurally, especially evangelical Christians. And you need to be careful lest we ignore the city centers, especially when oftentimes the people of the city centers don't like us. We are part of this whole city. Sometimes it's important that we remember that. If you look at Romans 13 as part of a nation, we need to see ourselves as most invested as citizens in a nation that may treat us more and more like foreigners. And when it comes to the world, we're to be witnesses to all nations, even to those who don't want us and even forbid us to come. That's the sacrificial service that we're called to. And if you believe that, then what that would put forward to put together the things from before is that you're here to discover happiness through your God-given purpose of serving others sacrificially out of love and truth. You are here, that is on this earth, the purpose of your life is to discover happiness through your God-given purpose of serving others sacrificially out of love and truth. You're meant to become a deep enough person and a person of enough emotional character that you find extraordinarily deep pleasures in sacrificially serving others. So much so that serving yourself again would sound and feel like an enormous downgrade. And if that sounds weird, it's because we have character work to do more than anything else. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk about 3 sort of culturally forgotten realities about sacrificial service. Things that are, I think, very biblical, but in our culture, they're pretty forgotten. The first is that sacrificial service is the price of influence. Sacrificial service is the price of influence. Because you might be thinking, well, Nick, honestly, when you go to the Bible, there isn't an enormous amount in there that we're supposed to be great at social programs and we're supposed to end hunger and poverty and that kind of stuff. That stuff isn't in the Bible. And you would be right to say that. That stuff isn't in the Bible. Let's just be clear about that. The church as a social action organization is not in the Bible. Yet the Bible does say, to the extent to which we can, we should do good to all people, especially the family of believers. It says that we should carry each other's burdens. The extent to which we need to do that in organizations or governmental organizations is arguable. But the point is that you could say, but Nick, we're a disciple-making organization. Absolutely. But guess what? People don't find us talking at them all that influencing. There's this book out by a pastor in, I think, California, Eugene Cho, that says, it's like something about like transforming. Can't remember the name. Overrated, I think, is the title, and the subtitle is something like, are we in love with the idea of changing the world more than changing the world? Which might get me to read a review, I think. You get this notion that like we like to talk and tweet and Facebook about changing the world. We'll give $10 there, we'll dump ice water here. But when it really comes to, with character over the long term, looking at the most desperate problems and sacrificing ourselves, our well-being, our large portions of our income over long periods of time, choosing to live in a different place, choosing not to move every 3 years, making the actual hard choices necessary for long-term impact in other people's lives by sacrificing ourselves, we are much less interested in that, and we practice it much less, especially if we have something else we can do that is chattering that helps us feel like we're doing enough or something. But when it comes right down to it, the last person that you wrote off was somebody that talked a big game and then you found out they weren't doing it. Right? Whether it's Al Gore talking about global warming and then having a mansion that uses a lot of electricity, or the last Republican guy that was the family values guy that found out doing non-family values things, or the pastor that had a mistress, or the whatever, right? You wrote them off not because they were wrong. You wrote them off because when they don't personally live it, even to the point of personal sacrifice beyond their self-interest, you know they don't really believe it, and so you're not going to believe it if they don't even believe it. People will start believing in Jesus in much larger numbers when we demonstrate beyond our own personal interests we believe very deeply. Our problem is not our arguments. Christian faith has an enormously intellectually robust argument for its truth. Enormously robust. I've spent 20 years in literature. I know this. That's not our problem. Secularism, the arguments of secularism aren't our problem. It's the secularism that's made its way in here that is our problem. Sorry if that was judgmental. It's true about me too. The second thing that people really forget is that contact is the context of change. You have to be with the people. There's this book written, The Tragedy of American Compassion, was written in the 80s by Marvin Olasky, and one of the things he said, he traces social programs of how the poor were helped throughout the entire history of America, all the way back to the founding to the present. And I'm particularly interested in the colonial part of that, where Jewish and Christian organizations helped people directly through churches and organizations that they founded, but they constantly insisted on personal contact to everybody who was involved in helping the poor. If you wanted to help the poor, great. Here's the address and the family you're going to be meeting with. You're going to meet with them weekly. You're not going to give them any money, and they're not going to ask you for any money. But you are going to go see them every week and talk with them about their life, talk with them about their problems, talk to them about what's going on, celebrate things that are going well in their life. You are going to be with them all the time. Why? Because if you don't, you can't engage on the level of empathy. The connection of humanness that is really necessary for transformation in you and in them can't happen. There's almost like a circuit that needs to be connected for the change in love to happen, and you've got to be there. We've got to be there, right? And not doing so is much, much more common among all peoples now, and it is producing a kind of bigotry even when we think we're becoming more progressive, okay? There's this...
All right, Gold Member. Don't play the laughing boy. There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch.
What?
I love that video. Right, it's very common for us to be feeling like we're becoming more indignantly tolerant when actually we're becoming more bigoted. And if you're not a Christian, if you have more secular or non-Christian sentimentalities, I would really encourage you to listen to this talk by Tim Keller on YouTube. It's a Belief in the Age of Skepticism. If you type in Tim Keller, Belief in the Age of Skepticism, you'll get it. And one of the things that he argues is that he says, listen, I know that I'm in a context where you believe religion is one of the things wrong with the world. And he says, let me just say something to start out with. I believe you're right. Right? And here's why he says that. Because self-righteous moralism has many logics. There's many ways to become self-righteously moralistic. You can think you're the only person who really knows the good science. Or you can think you're the only person who knows the right economics, or the only person who knows the right politics, or the only person that really understands the poor, or the only person who really understands your race and their plight, or the only person that really understands such and so, this experience, this orientation, this other thing, this, that, and everybody else just doesn't get it, and so I don't have to listen to you. But one of the ways people get there is religious. God told me I'm right, you're not, I don't have to listen to you. There's this logic that he offers in the talk that is a certain progression that happens to religious people, and because it happens to all human people, because our hearts are programmed for this kind of moralism. And that is that first there's some reason that you believe that you're right and they're wrong. And that right or wrong really kind of makes you better. And that could be because you believe in Christianity and it's better. You believe in Islam and it's better. You believe in atheism and it's better. You believe in secularism and it's better. Or it could be that like you grew up in a blue-collar family and you work really hard and you can't stand those people who don't work hard. Or you grew up in a white-collar family and you finished college and you just like smart people and good people work hard and finish college and get good jobs, and like those people that don't, like whatever. Or those people that worked hard and went to college and got jobs are sellouts. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to get there, but what it ends up leading to is a desire to separate from those people, because there's a kind of impurity you don't need to handle, and they're just obstinate. You've tried to correct them a number of times, and they won't listen. In fact, your side has a whole news station that constantly tells them they're wrong, and they won't agree. So, I mean, it's just there's no sense in being around them, because they just won't listen to the truth, and they live badly, which tends to lead to a phenomenon of caricature, which is this. People, when you're not around a certain kind of people, they become the thing you don't like about them. And that's all they are. Right? So the thing you share in common as human isn't first and foremost in when you think about them, but instead it's the basis of your disagreement, and they are that thing. So if you think they have a silly political ideology, if you think of them according to how they identify in terms of their orientation or what their race is or whatever, whether they're poor or whether they're middle class, whether they live in the inner city or the suburbs or the country, whatever it is, there's this idea that like they are that thing. And it almost surprises you that they live in Wisconsin and they're also a Packer fan. You're kind of like, well, I'm a Democrat and we're Packers fans. How could you be a Packers fan? right? Or like, I like sandwiches. How could you like sandwiches, right? You know what I mean? It's like, or like, I like having friends, or I like driving cars. How could you? I mean, it's like, you get this sort of like sense that like, but here's the thing. You would be surprised at how easily we will believe this sort of narrowness about each other when we're not around each other. And now that we have enormously useful technological tools to sort ourselves so we don't ever have to be around people not like us. We have enough channels and enough Twitter feeds and enough smartphones. We don't ever, even if we're around somebody we don't like, we could just go into our phone. You know what I mean? And now we've got, don't you love headphones? It's just like, I'm just not here. Right? G.K. Chesterton said, I think in the 1920s, the country club used to be a place where you would go to have a loud argument in the locker room with another person who was a Tory. Now the country club has been a place where you can go to make sure you don't run into anybody else with which you might have a loud conversation because you disagreed. We used to have civic organizations and things so that we could get together with people not like us and argue. And now we have them so we never have to be around people with which we would have to argue. What that ends up producing then is a passive sense that because they're just this narrow thing, you don't really have to protect them. It's okay if other people mess with them. Ultimately, you might get to the point where you'll say, in fact, they're so dangerous they have to be stopped, even if I have to take away their rights as a human being. Now, that's the bad news. And here's what I think is very important to recognize. You and I, because of the condition of the sinful nature, are programmed to treat other people this way. This is a fundamentally narrow and selfish way to think, and we are fundamentally narrow and selfish beings. This is what naturally happens among all peoples at all times, unless it is specifically and intentionally resisted. So what you could say about Keller's progression, you could say that there's an opposite gospel progression. And that is when you first start with the thing that you disagree on, you principally say, wait a second. I may feel like I'm better, but I know convictionally I'm not. One of the ways Keller puts it that I really like is he says, here's the thing. You and I, let's pretend you and I all believe the same thing and we're right about it. We all believe the same thing, we're right about it. He says, here's the thing. You and I will not be nearly as right as we think we are because of depravity. We will be worse than our philosophy. And the people we interact with who are made in the image of God will not be able to help but be better than their philosophy. So even if we were totally right and they were totally wrong, our depravity and their creation in the image of God will make us worse than our philosophy and them better than theirs. We better not get too cocky. You are not better than them. And I'm not better than them. Does that make sense? Once you put that principled humility in place, then you recognize Jesus' commands of love and you can intentionally relate to people that you would know you will naturally separate from. And what happens when you do that is empathy begins to be created. You begin to get to know them. You realize that there's a lot more to them than your disagreement. And usually when you don't like another person, they're being caricatured, some kind of reason they think that is attributed to them, and when you talk to them, you realize that's probably mostly not true. They're not the moral monster you've been taught to believe they are. And what that then creates is they sort of become your friend, and you begin to have this kind of romantic advocacy for them. And I mean that just in the sense of like it's emotional, it's passionate, it's intuitive. Like you don't necessarily have it all rationed out, but somebody picks on that person, and you're like, don't pick on that person. I know that person. I know what they're like, and they're not like that. It's like when a Democrat hears like some Republican that they know getting completely lambasted in the press, and they actually stick their neck out and go, listen, I disagree with Mr. Anderson too, but I know him, and he's not that. And you're just being a bigot. Let's argue on the thing he's wrong about instead of attacking him and his children, or vice versa. Right? You don't see a lot of that. That's that romantic advocacy, right? But what it really ought to lead to is a principled solidarity. That is where you say, wait a second, I might disagree with that person too, but you're going to have to come through me to get at them because they are a human being, same as me, and you are not going to treat them that way. Right? You even think that their views are dangerous. But their humanity precedes their ideology to you. And therefore, there is a human solidarity you have with them, even if you think. So you'll be like, all right, listen, we're going to fight. And then they back off. You go, okay, you're still stupid, though. Like, we have to talk about this. Like, that should be normal human life. Right? Now, if you think that's too complicated, you can just look at the slide with the second thing, right? Humility leads to relationship, leads to empathy, leads to advocacy, leads to solidarity. That's the progression of humility. That's what the gospel brings about. And it will happen if you principally force yourself into contact, because contact is the context of change. If you want to change in love, and you want other people to change through love and the application of sacrificial service, you have to get in there with people. You have to invite them over to your house. You have to speak with them and ask them about their life. You have to write a check. There was a small group not that long ago that somebody called the church and they said, so-and-so in our small group needs new tires and they can't afford them. And we said, you're their small group, do something. And they did. We thought that they'd just get mad at us. Small group got together, paid for the single mom's new tires. $500. Wrote her check, handed it off, took her over there. Why'd they do that? Who? They knew her, they loved her. They didn't have the money. I mean, sort of, maybe they apparently did. But once I said I wasn't going to do anything for them, I was like, I don't have church money for this. Right? They were like, oh. Well, we can't just let her not have tires. Well, we like her. Well, what are we going to do? We've called all the government agencies. Well, I mean, and they just did it because people do things like that when they love people. But love is the product of contact. And we've forgotten that. The third is that change is the price of understanding. Obedience is the price of understanding. That is, there's this verse in John's gospel where Jesus is talking to people who are not particularly enthused about his teaching, and he says, my teaching's not my own, it comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. You see, the implicit argument there is, he says, if you desire the will of God, is the more literal translation, and you walk into it, you do it, in the process of doing it, you'll actually find out that it's right. Here's what you need to realize, if you don't already realize it. There are a number of things in life, many of the most important, that cannot be explained and accepted by conceptual means. Right? Math is not one of them, right? You can sit down with somebody and be like, 2 + 2 = 4, and they're like, oh, okay, right. You don't have to get 2 rocks and count them, and then 2 birds and 2 birds and count them. You don't have to do that experientially 15 times. You just you can write it out. People go, oh yeah, you count it once. You're like, yep, 2 + 2 = 4, got it, right? There are other things that are learned experientially. You cannot really understand them until you sort of participate in them, right? So, for example, the most romantic book, relationally romantic book in the Bible is Song of Songs. There's the wife character in that book says a number of times in the poetry, I urge you, women of Jerusalem, buy the doe and fawn of the fields, and what's something we would not use today as a charge line. Do not awaken love before it's time. If you've read that book, you'll be familiar with that line because it's repeated throughout. What's she saying? She's saying in the process of meeting the man in the story and going through this courtship and getting married and so on, and there's all this poetry about the just incredibly intense romantic draw between these two that's extremely profound. She's like, now that I've experienced that, do not start that until you're ready to finish it. Right? Now, you can sit down with a 12-year-old girl and say, sweetie, I know there's all these sort of crush things going on in your class, and I think they're idiotic, and you think they're kind of fun, but you see, when these sorts of dynamics then get connected with puberty in a year or two here, and there's actually some real hormonal drive behind it, it creates these extraordinarily unhealthy relationships that nobody has the character to handle, and it produces this kind of promiscuity. You'll be paying for it for 30 years, right? They're going to look at you and go, like, they'll listen to you for like 4 sentences, and they're counting ceiling tiles. They're like, Daddy, when are you going to shut up? Like, honestly, I love you, but they don't actually say that. And that's not because you're wrong when you explain it to her. It's because she has no capacity to conceptualize what you're talking about. And so explaining the conceptuality of it doesn't work. And so Jesus just flatly says, look, there's stuff you have to do before you get. And here's the problem. Because so much of what Jesus tells us to do is completely counterintuitive to our sinful nature, almost everything he tells us we don't believe conceptually. But talk with somebody who's been walking with Jesus a while and ask them how they because here's what happens. You get this older Christian, right? You get this newer, kind of more secular person who's thinking about Christianity. And the older person believes like some very standard Christian doctrine. They're like, how can you believe that? Because their problem with it is conceptual because they haven't walked through it. The other person walked through it for 30 years. They get it. They've walked through it obedience-wise. They've seen how it works together and works out and how it happens. And they just sort of get it now. They've learned, but they learn through the process of obedience, right? And the other person is still fooling with it conceptually and fretting about it. Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why the problem of suffering is such a difficult question for Christians to answer, right? If God is all powerful and God is all good and people suffer, those three things shouldn't be compatible. Here's the problem. The thing God is doing with suffering, you have to walk through to understand. I can't explain it conceptually. That's why you don't like the answer. The problem with Christian faith is not that it has no answers to those questions. It has lots of very good conceptual answers to that question. But here's the problem. People don't accept it because it doesn't feel right to them. Like, I've shown people in cafeterias how logically that argument doesn't succeed. And I've watched them emotionally check out because they can't emotionally accept the purposes of God in suffering. And so they won't accept the conceptualization of it. When it comes to love and why we're meant to suffer in our sacrifice for others, why it makes sense that we would find a greater happiness in laying our lives down for each other, why the suffering of marriage and child rearing is ennobling and godliness creating, none of that makes sense to us. And it only makes sense when we commit ourselves to it, when we walk through it, when we come out the other side of it, and we begin to realize it over time. The cost of understanding, really understanding some of the most profound truths in the world is obedience. You have to do them before you'll understand them. And that's why we have so many trousered apes who walk around with these incredibly shallow worldviews and they think they're so smart and they're trolls all over the internet because they do not understand what it means to be human. And as the church, we should know better. Our truth became a human being to show us and then to teach us through obedience. He did all kinds of conceptual teaching, but he realized that wasn't enough, and he didn't leave us there. Lastly, what do you do? Okay, so now what? If that's all true, then what? Okay. One is, the first step is to believe you're here to serve. If that's like the do not pass go, do not collect, right? You're going to have to roll doubles to get out of that one. Like, you are here to serve. If you don't believe that, you can't go any further. That's what you're for. That's what you're here for. That's what you're meant for, right? The second is to use and seek gospel motivation, not religious motivation. You won't be able to live a life of sacrificial service out of the motivations of fear and pride. They're too paltry. They're too weak. They're too shallow. They will fail you when you need them the most. You have to find the joy and thankfulness of the redemption that comes through the Savior. You've got to find that to get you from here to there. The third is that your roles and duties count. Okay, there's so many people that are kind of like, well, how many times do I have to serve at the soup kitchen? And how many kids do I have to help read in a public school? And how many, and how much, and how many? Just hold on for a second there, Tiger. Before we get to that, your rightful vocations, duties, and roles are the main ways you serve others sacrificially. Okay? We pretend like that's not true. And that's partly because as a culture, we're starting to more and more misunderstand what civilization means. It's just part of it, okay? You've got to understand what it means. Your duties, if you're a single adult, there are moral duties of friendship you have with the people around you. They're not just your Twitter buddies. They're not just like, oh, let's go have lunch. You should be bound to them in a bond of friendship that is in some ways similar to a deep commitment. If you consent to be a friend, you are morally obligated to be one. And you are the most free of roles in the church. The minute you become a husband or a wife, a father or a mother, the minute you get a job where your job is actually to provide something for other people, yes, there's an economic exchange, but your job should be something that makes somebody else's life better. It should be giving them something they desire that isn't directly hurting them. Whether you're running a restaurant, whether you're cleaning basements, whether you're doing doctoring, whether you're teaching somebody at school, whether you're mothering children, whatever you're doing, and even if you're like, well, I kind of make money at it, I'm kind of trading my time for money, though. I mean, well, A, that shouldn't be your motivation when you're working. And B, if you embrace the roles of family and life, and you're taking that money and you're not going out and buying milkshakes with it. You're going home and using that money to sacrificially fulfill other responsibilities. Your roles and your duties and your responsibilities are the main ways you sacrificially serve others. And don't overlook those, or you'll be full of some kind of stress that you really don't need to feel. The fourth is organic first, then organizational. Alexi and I have struggled with, because we got 4 kids, I kind of work long hours and long weeks. There's always people kind of being inserted into my life, and we have a really hard time getting the whole brood together and getting out somewhere to serve at the soup kitchen or the food pantry or the blah, blah, blah. And it's frustrating for us because I want to lead in everything I'm telling people to do. Otherwise, I'm not going to have influence because people will see right through me. And so I'm like, we have to do this. And then we have people come by every once in a while. They're like, man, the way you guys have your house open and we come over and that you met with me at this time and Alexi made the sacrifice so you could go to that thing and we did it. It's really awesome. And then we have this reality check of like, okay, yeah, that's right. Hospitality and friendship. Hospitality and friendship is the heart of what we're doing. And then when we will find some things that we're not happy with their outcomes through just hospitality and friendship. We'll look at something like reading rates in elementary schools, especially in the more African-American neighborhoods, and we'll get mad enough about that to do something, and we'll all be tutors in the school down the street, right? That's next year, so don't get too upset right now. But Lloyd does that every week. Lloyd Biddle, every week. There's one day he comes in late because he goes over to that school and he reads with 3 kids. Right? And he has to work longer hours another night because he does that. Right? He just wants to. He's just mad about that in a passionate, godly, convictional kind of way. And so he does something about it. But he started going through an organization, and then he met the teacher and got to know her, and now he just works with the school with a teacher in the class. Right? But sometimes we'll need organizations, and sometimes those organizations will be governmental. And as the church, even if they don't like some things about us, we'll still work with them because we want to do things. But start little, start organic, start being friends with, take out to lunch. You can come over to my house to watch the game. Let's have dinner together. Like one of the things Lexi and I do is there's a couple in the church. They're married and they don't have any kids, and we just went up to them and said, "Why do you cook dinner for yourself on Tuesday nights? It's just the 2 of you. We already have dinner for 9 at our house. What's 2 more? Just come over to our house on Tuesdays." Right? That's it. And they come over most Tuesdays. Use the power of predecision. There's a lot of sociological evidence that says this. You want to do something, but you won't do it. But when you decide you're going to do it, oftentimes you'll do it. I've told you about my no ice cream after 8 o'clock rule, right? I've already decided I don't eat ice cream after 8 o'clock. Have I eaten ice cream after 8 o'clock? Occasionally. But I tell you what, I'll go get some, and my daughter will be like, "Daddy," or my wife will be, right? And I know anybody could ask me, and I know that I've decided in my saner moments when I am not looking at some kind of moose tracks that I want to be the kind of person that doesn't do that. And I made that decision already. And I know I was in sound mind when I do that. So I know what I'm experiencing now is temptation. And I know I'm not going to do it. I've pre-decided. I've already decided I'm not going to divorce my wife. I've decided that. I don't talk about it. I don't think about it. I don't entertain it. I don't dream about it. I've decided I'm not going to do it. Right? And see, some of you've been to church, you go to church once a month or once a quarter or something like that. Listen, the next step for you with the church of God is just you just need to decide you go to church. That's all. And you won't come every single week, but until you decide you go to church, you just won't very consistently. Because why? Because every Sunday it's a decision. Well, are we going to go to church or not? And then you've got like a miscommunication with your wife, and the kids stayed up late the night before because you don't go to church automatically on Sunday, right? Same thing with small group. Do you go to small group or don't you, right? Are you? You see, pre-decision pushes you into things you won't otherwise do. If you have a conviction that you're here to serve, pre-decide you're going to serve. Sign up. Tell people you're going to do it. You kick your small group leader in the behind and say, hey, when are we going to serve? Because we said we were going to do it. If you pre-decide you will do things, you will not have the self-discipline to do otherwise. And then lastly, kickstart it this week by signing up right now. Decide right now you're going to sign up right now and do it and get yourself rolling in that direction. Now, one of the reasons why this is part of this 6 weeks is not because we're trying to have this big crescendo, like so that we can come in here, we can be like, we had 340 people go out into Madison, and they should be so glad that we're here because we're so awesome. No, like we'll work like 3 hours on a Saturday. That's like it's not that exciting, okay? But here's why we're doing it. So everybody understands how we do it. You join a small group. The small group connects with the hub, our electronic mechanism by which we connect with others for community and we plan for action. We use it to come together as a small group, and then as a small group, we can just easily go on the hub, find a service opportunity, and go out and do it. And everybody knows what it's like because you're going to do it this week, and then you can be the person who drives in your small group and goes, hey, what are we doing that? And here's the thing. Your small group leader is tentative to say, hey, when are we going to serve? Because they think you're going to complain about it. They think you're going to be like, well, Sally has that soccer game, and I'm cooking lasagna on Thursday, and I just don't see how we could fit this in, right? And they're going to, because Lloyd and I are telling them, and you need to say, hey, when are we going to do it? Like, it's the first quarter is, January, February, March. Like, when are we serving? Like, can we go to the hub tonight as small group and pick our time and pick our place and pre-decide and get some shared peer pressure and move in that direction and get out there and do it. And once you experience the contact, you see that sacrificial service produces influence. Instead of moving towards separation and caricature, you start moving towards real empathy and desire to fight for and be with other people. You'll begin to experience through obedience the real change that comes when you take Jesus at his word, you try it, you see it, you do it, and you experience it. And it will affect us individually. It will cause us to unclutter a bunch of things and focus our lives, and it will change us as a church from a group of self-righteous people, not saying that's what we are now, but we'll become one of these two things. We'll either become a self-righteous group of people who like the idea of changing the world more than helping our neighbor, or we'll become a kind of people who, through convictional humility, seek to be like Jesus, serving other people, so that we can actually have some influence, and so that we can grow through obedience because we choose to be in contact with people that Jesus loves. Does that make sense? Let's pray then. Father, we do not want to leave something at the absolute heart of Christian faith undone. You've called us to love our neighbor. You've said we're here to serve. You've used language not just of becoming a servant, but becoming a slave to all. And we recognize that hyperbolic language like that is meant to show us how radically you believe in this thing you're teaching us. And we don't want to be frazzled with we need to get out and do one more thing, but we want to be people who convictionally desire to be connected to people who we can serve and to serve them lovingly. Please help us to be that kind of people. In Jesus' name.